The late summer of 1999 carried with it the restless hum of cicadas and the sweet heaviness of days that seemed too long, yet never long enough for two best friends who were standing at the threshold of adulthood. They had grown up side by side in a small town where every face was familiar and every corner carried a memory. For them, the forest that edged their world was not a place of menace but of freedom, a place where silence wasn't frightening but instead liberating, where trails felt like open invitations and where the weight of expectation could be momentarily left behind. That August morning, with backpacks slung carelessly, with laughter lingering in their voices, they stepped onto the dirt path that would become the last anyone would see of them. The moment seemed ordinary, too ordinary to bear the weight of the years of mystery it would carry. The girls were caught in that magical in-between of youth, where they were still children in their parents' eyes but already tasting independence in their own. The world ahead felt endless, and the hike, planned for just a few hours, was nothing more than a small adventure. They promised to be back before dusk, their voices breezy, unaware that dusk would come and go without them. The trail swallowed them as it always had, only this time, it would not return them. Back at home, the day unfolded like any other. A mother made coffee, poured it into the same chipped mug she used every morning. A father adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror before heading to work. The air was still sticky with summer heat, windows open to let in the faint breeze, radios playing songs that would later feel like cruel time capsules. Life, in those first hours, moved with the slow rhythm of a normal day. Their absence hadn't yet been noticed, the rupture hadn't yet torn through the fabric of ordinary living. But as shadows stretched longer across the streets, as the sun began to sink and lamps flickered on inside kitchens, the first quiet tugs of unease crept in. The girls should have been back. They weren't the type to vanish without word. Dinner was plated but untouched, phone calls went unanswered. Parents looked at clocks, then at one another, trying to swallow the tight coil of fear building in their stomachs. At first, they gave reason to the absence. Perhaps the girls had lingered longer than expected, stopping to talk, stopping to laugh. Perhaps their watches had lost track of time as youth so often did. When the first phone call was made to a neighbor, the tone was still casual, still searching for reassurance. Have you seen them? Did they stop by? But reassurance never came. And when the parents stepped out into their porches, looking toward the darkening woods, there was a heaviness in the air that no summer evening had carried before. It was the stillness of something gone wrong. By nightfall, the trail was no longer a place of freedom but of dread. Flashlights pierced through branches, voices echoed into the void, names were shouted with a desperation that tore through the quiet. At first, the search was clumsy, parents stumbling with urgency, neighbors joining in with half belief, half denial. The forest absorbed every sound, returning nothing but the hollow silence of its endless expanse. The girls' laughter, once so loud in memory, now felt unbearably distant. Every minute stretched unbearably. Time slowed, thickened, became untrustworthy. Parents thought of the lunches they had packed, the beds still unmade, the school assignments waiting for signatures. They thought of all the ordinary threads still hanging, now suspended in the air as if mocking them. How could something so irreversible happen inside the folds of such an ordinary day? That question would never leave them. What begins as the unexplained always carries with it the illusion of solvability. At first, everyone believed that the forest would give them back, that the teens were merely lost and would emerge with sheepish smiles, apologizing for the worry they caused. But the deeper the night wore on, the heavier that illusion became, until it collapsed under its own weight. Absence has a way of hardening. It begins as an inconvenience, then becomes a wound, then transforms into a truth too heavy to hold. By midnight, the woods were no longer alive with possibility but with fear. Every branch crack seemed sinister, every shadow suggested something unseen. The searchers kept moving, kept calling, because to stop was to admit the unthinkable, that the girls had stepped into the trees and vanished into a place beyond reach. The first night of absence is always the sharpest, the cruelest, because hope still feels tangible, still feels close enough to touch. Parents convinced themselves that the morning light would bring answers, that the dawn would scatter the shadows and reveal the girls sitting tired but safe somewhere, waiting to be found. And so they waited for sunrise as though it were salvation itself. But in those hours, as the town lay awake, listening for news that never came, the story of two teenage friends began to transform. They were no longer just daughters or classmates or neighbors. They became a question, an ache, a silence that filled every home. And though no one yet knew it, that silence would stretch on not just for hours or days but for years, reshaping lives and binding the town to a mystery it would never truly escape. The girls' last steps into the forest became the vanishing point, a place where ordinary life split apart from what came after, a place that marked the beginning of a story without end. And while no one could have understood it that night, the forest had already chosen to keep it secret. They were only 17, yet already standing on that fragile border between innocence and independence, carrying with them all the contradictions of youth. To understand the gravity of their disappearance, one must first understand who they were, not merely faces on a missing poster, but flesh and blood teenagers, brimming with restless energy, secrets whispered under blankets, and the kind of dreams that belong to people still untouched by the cruel weight of the world. Their absence would later echo so loudly because their presence, when they were alive and laughing, had filled so much space. The first of the two was known for her light. Her laughter seemed to spill out of her as though she carried an endless well of joy. She had a softness to her that drew people in, but behind her warmth lived an intensity. She kept journals stacked beneath her bed, each page filled with sketches of imagined places and letters she never sent. She dreamed of leaving the town one day, of seeing cities that pulsed with neon lights and oceans that stretched further than her imagination. Teachers described her as bright, though prone to drifting away in thought during class, eyes fixed on windows instead of chalkboards. Friends described her as loyal, the one who stayed up late on the phone listening to heartbreaks, the one who believed in people even when they failed her. The other carried a different kind of fire. Where her best friend was light, she was steel. Her confidence wasn't loud but steady, rooted in determination. She had a love for the outdoors that made her the natural leader of their hiking trips. She collected maps, not as decoration but as guides for where she hoped her feet would carry her. She had spoken often about becoming a wildlife photographer, of turning her fascination with wild places into a life's purpose. She was the one who convinced her friend to join the hiking trip that August afternoon, persuading her with the promise of fresh air and a sky painted with summer's final shades of blue. Together, they were a balance, two halves of a friendship that had carried them through awkward middle school years, through school dances where they whispered about crushes, through afternoons spent sprawled across bedroom floors surrounded by cassette tapes and magazines. Their bond was the kind of friendship that felt unbreakable, forged not only through shared laughter but also through silences that didn't need explanation. To outsiders, they seemed inseparable, like sisters bound by choice rather than blood. That summer of 1999 was supposed to be one of possibility. The girls had just finished their junior year of high school, and their senior year loomed like both a promise and a question mark. College brochures lay scattered on kitchen counters, teachers spoke of futures that felt impossibly large, and the girls themselves spoke in whispered tones about what they wanted from life. One dreamed of art and cities, the other of forests and photography. Their paths might have diverged one day, but on that summer afternoon, they were still walking the same trail together, side by side, as they always had. Photographs from those months would later feel like relics. In one, they sit on the hood of an old car, the setting sun behind them, both laughing at something no one else remembers. In another, they stand in a field, hair whipped by wind, their arms looped casually around each other's shoulders. To their families, these images would become painful treasures, proof of their existence, frozen moments of vitality that could never be repeated. The town, small and close-knit, had always known them as more than just individuals. They babysat neighborhood children, worked summer jobs at the local diner, walked home from school with groups of friends who would later speak of how ordinary the last conversations had been. There was no foreshadowing in their goodbyes, no dark undertones in their laughter. Life, for them, was unfolding in the way it always had, predictable, steady, filled with the quiet drama of adolescence. And yet, within that ordinariness lay the very reason their story would haunt so deeply. They weren't reckless thrill-seekers. They weren't running away. They weren't burdened with secrets that suggested escape. They were simply teenagers on a trail, walking into the woods with the expectation of returning home. The mundane nature of their last known day made what followed so unbearable. Their disappearance wasn't cloaked in crime or chaos at first glance. It was wrapped in the unbearable simplicity of two girls vanishing from a world that had always been theirs. On that morning, they had packed their bags lightly, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, water bottles, a disposable camera that one of them insisted on bringing to capture the golden light filtering through the trees. They teased each other about who would complain first when the trail grew steep, argued briefly over music, and laughed as they started the familiar walk. There was no fear, no hesitation. To them, it was just another small adventure, the kind they had taken countless times before. When the news of their disappearance spread, the first images that flashed in the minds of those who loved them were not of fear but of these ordinary moments, their laughter at kitchen tables, the way they sprawled across couches after school, the sound of their voices rising together in songs sung off-key. These portraits of youth were what made their absence unbearable. They weren't statistics. They weren't headlines. They were daughters, sisters, friends, two young women who carried within them the promise of lives still unwritten. And so, when their tent was discovered on the trail days later, empty, zipped shut as though untouched, the contrast was too much to bear. All the warmth, all the light and fire of who they were, clashed violently against that image of vacancy. An empty tent in a vast forest, 2 lives missing from it, and the unbearable silence that came in place of their voices. That silence was the beginning of a story that would stretch across decades, but in the hearts of those who loved them, it was also the ending of the world as they had known it. Night has a way of sharpening absence. What had begun as worry in the golden hours of dusk turned into something heavier when the last traces of light bled from the horizon and the forest folded itself into darkness. Parents stood at their windows first, peering out into the tree line as if the girls might suddenly emerge from the shadows, laughing and apologizing. When the minutes slipped into hours and no footsteps approached, the stillness pressed harder, and panic, real, undeniable panic, set in. The call went out to neighbors before midnight. This was a small town in 1999, a place where everyone knew each other's names and where the sound of a phone ringing late at night was enough to pull people from their sleep. Families who had no direct ties to the girls pulled on jackets and boots anyway, carrying flashlights that cut thin beams through the summer night. What began as a household's frantic search widened into a community movement, and by the time the clock struck 1 in the morning, the trailhead was alive with voices, calling the girls' names into the suffocating dark. The forest did not answer. It swallowed every sound whole. The flashlights flickered across branches, across rocks, across shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. Volunteers pressed forward, their voices rising into the canopy. "Come on, girls, answer us. Just shout if you can hear." Each call was met with silence so absolute that it began to feel like a presence itself, like something alive pressing back. Searchers began to glance at one another, as though the silence itself carried meaning they couldn't yet name. Dogs were brought in, their noses low to the ground, tails stiff. At first, there was hope. They barked, they pulled, they seemed to catch a scent. But the trail splintered, and each path ended abruptly, as though the forest itself had erased its own story. The dogs grew restless, circling, whining, unable to lead anyone forward. Their confusion only deepened the dread. Parents followed the searchers, though their legs trembled with exhaustion. They clutched one another's hands in the dark, whispering prayers, bargaining silently with whatever higher power might be listening. Some moments, they convinced themselves they heard movement, a branch snapping, a footstep, the faint echo of laughter. Each time, they rushed forward, only to find emptiness waiting for them. Hope was raised and crushed again and again until it became almost unbearable to feel. By 3 in the morning, the trail had become a surreal stage. The light of dozens of flashlights darted across the trees like fireflies, weaving frantic patterns across the undergrowth. The volunteers moved like figures in a dream, voices echoing, faces pale, the weight of fatigue bending their shoulders. The forest, usually a place of childhood play and summer adventure, had turned into a labyrinth, endless and unyielding. What once felt familiar now seemed strange, even threatening. There were moments of eerie intimacy that night. A neighbor's voice broke as she called the girls' names, the syllables catching in her throat. A classmate, still barely a child himself, sat on a log sobbing into his hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was unfolding. Parents tried to hold themselves together but faltered under the heaviness of imagining what their daughters might be facing in the dark. Their minds cycled through unbearable possibilities, each one worse than the last. As hours dragged on, the searchers began to notice the sheer absence of evidence. No discarded water bottles, no footprints beyond the ones at the trailhead, no clothing snagged on branches. It was as if the girls had stepped off the earth itself. The forest, usually so alive with chirping insects and rustling leaves, seemed unusually still, as though it too was holding its breath. That unnatural quiet added to the growing sense that this was not simply a matter of 2 teenagers losing their way. Something else lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. Around 4 a.m., local police joined the effort. Their flashlights were brighter, their voices firmer, but even authority could not bend the forest to its will. They organized lines, sweeping through sections with precision. Yet the result was always the same: nothing. No sound, no movement, no trace. Each time they regrouped, their faces revealed more doubt, more unease. Officials were trained to contain panic, but even they could not mask the sinking realization settling into everyone's bones. For the families, the hours blurred. Time lost its meaning in the dark. What felt like minutes was often hours, what felt like hours was sometimes only moments. The forest seemed endless, and the night stretched without mercy. The parents began to notice details that clung to them, the chill in the air despite the season, the way dew settled on leaves, the faint metallic scent of soil after a long day's heat. These sensory fragments became etched into their memories, tied forever to the moment when hope began to crack. When dawn finally broke, it came without relief. Pale light crept slowly through the branches, painting the forest in muted gray. Searchers hoped the day would reveal what the night had concealed, but instead, morning only clarified the absence. The girls were nowhere. Their voices had not answered, their figures had not emerged from the tree line. The trail stretched quiet and empty, bearing no witness to what had unfolded. That first night was when the story changed forever. It was the night the girls became more than missing, they became a mystery. Parents had gone to bed countless nights believing their children would always be under the same roof, safe within reach. That night shattered that certainty. From then on, life divided itself into before and after. Before, when laughter was taken for granted. After, when silence spoke louder than any sound. The forest had taken them, or so it seemed. And as the sun rose on that first morning of absence, no one could yet imagine that years later, the questions born that night would still linger, unanswered, growing heavier with each retelling. That first night of silence was not merely the beginning of a search, it was the beginning of a wound that would never fully close. The search widened as the days stretched on, and what had begun as a frantic gathering of neighbors with flashlights soon became an orchestrated effort that drew in professionals from beyond the town's borders. The forest, vast and tangled, became a stage for determination and despair alike. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the sky into a mechanical hum that echoed down into the valleys. Dogs padded tirelessly across trails, noses pressed to the earth, weaving back and forth as handlers urged them forward. From the ground, human chains of volunteers pressed deeper into the pines, their voices steady at first, then breaking into desperation as they called the girls' names over and over. The woods themselves seemed to resist. They gave no clues, no objects carelessly left behind, no bent branches to mark a path. Instead, they stood in silence, tall pines guarding whatever secret they had been asked to hold. At times, a flicker of hope would rise, a set of footprints that turned out to be the tracks of deer, a scrap of fabric that was only weather-worn cloth, a sound in the distance that was nothing more than the shifting wind. The cycle of hope and disappointment repeated endlessly, fraying the nerves of everyone involved. By the third day, the effort had grown massive. Local news stations arrived, their cameras capturing tired faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Reporters spoke into microphones about the two missing teenagers, their voices carefully measured. But behind them, the footage showed something raw, mothers clutching each other's hands, fathers walking the perimeter of the search area with hollow eyes, younger siblings sitting on coolers with blank expressions that betrayed their inability to comprehend. The disappearance was no longer a family tragedy, it had become a community crisis. Still, the forest gave nothing back. It swallowed the scent trails, confused the dogs with overlapping smells of wildlife and soil. Helicopters hovered low, their infrared cameras scanning for heat signatures, but all they revealed were the restless shapes of deer moving through brush or the vague warmth of sunlit rocks. The girls were nowhere. Each passing hour deepened the sense that this was not just a matter of being lost. Something more elusive, more chilling, seemed to have occurred. For those who searched, exhaustion set in quickly. The terrain was rugged, the late summer heat unforgiving. Volunteers returned from long sweeps with blistered feet, their water bottles drained, their voices hoarse. Yet no one wanted to leave. To walk away felt like betrayal, as if abandoning the forest might mean abandoning the girls themselves. And so they pushed forward, clinging to the belief that maybe, just beyond the next rise, the girls were waiting, tired, scared, but alive. Families lived in a liminal state during those days. At home, the bedrooms remained untouched, beds still neatly made, notebooks left open on desks, shoes lined at the foot of closets. These ordinary artifacts mocked the parents with their stillness. Every object seemed to whisper that the girls should be here, that they should be walking through the front door at any moment. At the search site, the parents hovered close, trying to offer food, water, and gratitude to the searchers, but their eyes never stopped scanning the tree line. Every flicker of movement sparked a rush of adrenaline, followed quickly by crushing disappointment. Nights were the hardest. Each evening, when searchers had to pull back for safety, the forest fell silent again, and families were left with the unbearable image of their daughters in the dark, alone and unreachable. Some parents refused to sleep, staying awake on porches, listening for sounds they knew would never come. Others collapsed into shallow, restless dreams haunted by visions of their daughters calling for help. Morning always came, but with it came a new wave of despair, another day passed without answers. The psychology of the search shifted with time. In the first hours, everyone believed recovery was inevitable, that the girls would be found alive. By the fourth or fifth day, hope began to mix with fear. Searchers whispered quietly among themselves, questioning how long two teenagers could survive in the wilderness with limited supplies. Parents overheard these whispers, and each overheard word became a dagger. The girls, once imagined sitting safe under a tree, were now imagined shivering, dehydrated, frightened, or worse. But still, no evidence surfaced. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them. A hiker's compass pointed toward nothing, maps became meaningless. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, paths looping back in ways that confused even those who knew the land well. For many, it began to feel uncanny, as if the woods were not merely a setting but a force, an entity unwilling to give up what it had taken. And yet, the families refused to let go. They pressed on, day after day, holding onto the fragile thread of possibility. Each search party that set out carried not just equipment but prayers. Each shout of the girls' names carried not only desperation but love. The forest may have been silent, but the people filled it with their cries, refusing to accept the void. The echo of those cries, cutting through pine and shadow, would linger long after the search was called off. For in those days, what the community realized most painfully was that absence is not empty. It is heavy, unbearable, alive in its own way. And the silence that returned after each unanswered call would haunt them for years, becoming part of the landscape itself. In the absence of answers, stories grow. When the days of searching turned to weeks, and the forest gave back no sign of the girls, the town itself became a breeding ground for speculation. At first, these were quiet whispers spoken in grocery aisles or on church steps, fragments of sentences that broke off before becoming too heavy. But whispers rarely stay small. With each day that the mystery remained unsolved, those fragments hardened into rumors, and rumors swelled into narratives that took on lives of their own. Some believed the girls had run away. The theory gained traction quickly among those who preferred an explanation rooted in choice rather than horror. People spoke of teenage rebellion, of secret boyfriends, of letters never mailed but supposedly hidden in drawers. None of these supposed details existed in reality, but that hardly mattered. In the absence of truth, imagination filled the void. To some, it was easier to imagine the girls boarding a bus toward freedom than to face the thought of them lost in the woods or trapped in something darker. Parents dismissed this theory with exhausted anger, pointing to the uneaten lunches in the refrigerator, the clothes left in their closets, the dreams that had tethered them to home. But still, the rumor lingered like a shadow, whispering doubt into every conversation. Others turned their eyes toward darker possibilities. The late 1990s were marked by a cultural fear of strangers and cults, fueled by media stories of abductions and sinister gatherings. In hushed tones, people wondered aloud if someone had been waiting in the woods that day, someone who lured or forced the girls away. A drifter, perhaps, or a person hiding from the law. Stories emerged of strange cars parked near trailheads in the weeks before, though no one could say for certain if those memories were real or reshaped by hindsight. The forest became not just a backdrop but a suspect, a place where anything could hide, a predator, a secret camp, something human cloaked in the wilderness. Then came the strangest rumors, those that blurred the line between folklore and fear. The forest around town had always carried its share of stories, tales passed down about abandoned cabins, about places where compasses spun uselessly, about people who wandered off trails and returned hours later with no memory of where they had been. Some whispered that the girls had stumbled into such a place, not taken by a person but by the woods themselves. These ideas were dismissed openly but held secretly in many hearts, because they explained what the evidence could not, how two teenagers could vanish so completely without a trace. The media amplified every whisper. Local stations interviewed classmates who could barely articulate their grief but found their words broadcast as fuel for speculation. National outlets arrived, hungry for a story with both tragedy and mystery. They painted the town as a place caught in limbo, its people as characters in a haunting drama. With cameras rolling, speculation became performance. People repeated rumors not because they believed them, but because the silence felt too heavy to carry alone. Every microphone seemed to demand an answer, and when no answer could be found, possibilities were spoken into existence simply to fill the void. For the families, the rumors were unbearable. They watched as their daughters' lives were reduced to theories, their laughter and humanity flattened into headlines about runaways, rituals, or mystery vanishings. Grief twisted into anger, not just at the unknown but at the way strangers spoke as though they owned the story. Each rumor felt like a theft, taking the girls further away from who they really were. Mothers clung to photographs, repeating aloud the details that mattered: her love of drawing, her habit of singing to the radio, her dream of traveling. Fathers grew defensive, correcting reporters with quiet fury. Their daughters were not mysteries, they were children. But small towns are living things, and once stories take root, they are nearly impossible to uproot. Neighbors who had once shared casseroles and laughter began to look at each other differently. Suspicion crept in. If no trace had been found, perhaps someone among them knew more than they were saying. A handyman who lived near the edge of the forest found himself the subject of quiet stares. A teacher who had once given one of the girls a ride home suddenly felt the weight of whispered questions. Everyone wanted to assign blame, to place the unbearable uncertainty onto someone's shoulders, no matter how unfair. This is how absence warps a place. It creates tension where there was once trust, shadows where there was once light. The girl's disappearance became not just a tragedy but a mirror, reflecting the town's deepest fears and suspicions. Each person carried their own version of the story, and none aligned. For some, the girls were still alive, hiding somewhere, waiting to return. For others, they had been taken, their fates already sealed. For a few, the forest itself had devoured them in ways no human mind could comprehend. What no one admitted aloud, though everyone felt, was that these rumors served a purpose. They gave shape to the shapeless. They offered something to cling to in the void left by silence. Even when the stories were cruel, even when they hurt the families, they were easier than the truth that no one wanted to face, that the girls had disappeared, and no one knew why. And so the town lived on in this suspended state, a place buzzing with theories but starved of evidence. Each rumor echoed louder than the last, until it became difficult to separate fact from fiction. The search continued, but beneath it, the whispers spread like wildfire, turning the mystery of two missing teenagers into something larger than life, something haunting and unstoppable. What began as hope had now twisted into something else, a story too heavy to hold, a silence too vast to ignore, and a town that could no longer find comfort in the ordinary rhythms of life. The discovery of the cabin shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Until that moment, the case had lived in fragments, trails that led nowhere, maps drawn and redrawn, theories whispered but never grounded in evidence. The forest had remained indifferent, offering only silence. But then, one autumn afternoon nearly a year after the girl's disappearance, two hunters stumbled upon a place that seemed to have been waiting all along, an abandoned cabin, hidden beneath a canopy of pines so thick that sunlight barely reached its moss-covered roof. At first glance, it was unremarkable, just another weather-beaten structure lost to time, sagging beneath years of storms and neglect. But the hunters felt something different as they approached. The air was unnervingly still, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The door, half-rotted and askew, creaked when nudged. Inside, the space was cloaked in dust, as if no one had lived there in decades. But then came the detail that unsettled them. In the corner, beneath layers of dirt and cobwebs, sat a small pile of belongings that looked too new to belong to the cabin's long-past era. A backpack with faded straps. A shoe, its laces frayed but its style unmistakably from the 1990s. The hunters backed out quickly, hearts pounding, and contacted the authorities. For the first time in months, the police had something tangible, something beyond speculation. They cordoned off the area, treating it like the fragile scene of a revelation. Investigators stepped carefully across the warped floorboards, cataloging every scrap of evidence. What they found deepened the mystery rather than solved it. The belongings were indeed linked to the missing girls. A notebook with doodles in the margin. A hair clip, snapped in two. Photographs crumpled but recognizable, showing the girls smiling at school events and birthday parties. These items should not have been there. They should have been safe in their bedrooms, tucked inside drawers or pinned to corkboards. Their presence in the cabin suggested that at some point, the girls, or at least their possessions, had made it far beyond where the official searches had ended. And yet, the cabin bore no obvious signs of habitation. There were no fresh food wrappers, no bedding, no evidence of fire or warmth. It felt like a place where time had stopped. Investigators began to wonder, had the cabin been a temporary shelter? A hideout? Or worse, a place where the girls had been taken against their will? Every item hinted at presence, yet absence echoed in every corner. The emotional impact on the families was devastating. For months, they had been suspended in the unbearable unknown, and now they were given a glimpse that was both too much and not enough. Holding their daughter's belongings was both proof and torment, proof that the girls had been somewhere tangible, but torment because the objects answered none of the questions that mattered most. Were they alive when the items were placed there? Were they alone? Did they leave willingly, or were they forced? The media seized on the discovery, framing the cabin as a haunted landmark in the case. Headlines screamed about the cabin of secrets, as if the structure itself were a villain holding back the truth. Cameras filmed its decaying frame from every angle, while journalists speculated endlessly about what might have happened inside. To the families, it felt like another invasion, as though grief itself had been placed on display. Meanwhile, the town's whispers grew louder. The cabin became a place of pilgrimage for curiosity seekers, though police tried to restrict access. Some locals claimed to remember the cabin from their childhood, insisting it had always carried a reputation for unease. Others swore they had never seen it before, as if it had emerged from the forest only when the story needed it. Myths tangled with reality until it was difficult to tell one from the other. For investigators, the cabin offered both promise and frustration. On one hand, it broke the paralysis of the search. It was a lead, a concrete fragment of the truth. On the other, it raised new questions that stretched far beyond the town's borders. Who had last used the cabin? Why was it hidden so deep in the woods, so far from marked trails? And why, after all these months of intensive searching, had it remained invisible until now? Perhaps the most haunting element was the sense of silence within the cabin. It was not just abandoned, it was abandoned with intention. There was no chaos of flight, no scattered signs of struggle. The items seemed almost placed, as if arranged to be found, or left behind in haste that still bore an eerie order. It was this detail that kept investigators awake at night, the feeling that the cabin was not simply a remnant of the past, but a stage where something unspeakable had been enacted, and then meticulously concealed. The families, torn between gratitude for a lead and devastation at what it implied, returned home each night with heavier hearts. They clutched the recovered belongings like fragile relics, knowing they were holding pieces of the girl's last known chapter. And yet, in their silence, the belongings offered no answers, only a whisper of presence, a trace of a life interrupted, a ghost of a moment when two girls had crossed a threshold and never returned. The cabin, with its sagging roof and hollow rooms, became more than a place. It became a symbol of the entire case, a structure still standing, but warped by time and mystery, a vessel for silence that echoed louder than any scream. And in that silence, the town found itself once again circling the same questions, each more unbearable than the last. The cabin's discovery should have provided clarity, but instead it seemed to deepen the abyss. For every answer it offered, 10 new questions sprouted, each one more unsettling than the last. Investigators combed the area for days, returning with dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic teams. They scoured the soil around the cabin, searching for buried remains, clothing fibers, or evidence of campsites. They marked trees with fluorescent tape and combed through old survey maps, trying to determine how long the structure had been there. Yet, for all their meticulous effort, the forest resisted their probing. It offered no clear narrative, only fragments too jagged to fit together. The items found inside the cabin, the notebooks, the shoes, the photographs, were confirmed to belong to the girls. Forensic testing revealed little beyond that. No fingerprints beyond their own were recoverable. No DNA traces that could suggest the presence of another person. The cabin felt scrubbed, too clean for what it should have been. Investigators considered whether weather and time had erased evidence, but some of them whispered another possibility, that someone had deliberately wiped the place down, leaving just enough to torment, and nothing that could identify them. Theories emerged quickly. Some detectives suspected the girls had stumbled upon the cabin during their hike and sought refuge there. Perhaps they became lost in the woods, found the shelter, but never made it back out. Yet this theory faltered under scrutiny. If they had stayed there, why was there no sign of food wrappers, water bottles, or campfires? Why did the items seem more abandoned than used? Others suggested something darker, that the cabin had been a holding place. That the girls had been taken there against their will, left to wait in the silence while the rest of the world searched desperately for them. This idea chilled even the most seasoned investigators. The cabin, after all, was hidden enough to serve as a perfect prison. Out of sight, off the maps, tucked so deeply in the trees that even helicopters would have missed it from the air. But if that were true, why had the girls' belongings been left behind? Why not burn them, or carry them away? Unless, of course, leaving them was intentional. A message. A taunt. Or worse, a ritual of sorts, something only the perpetrator understood. The townspeople seized upon these possibilities, twisting them into new narratives. Coffee shop conversations turned to theories about hidden roads leading deeper into the woods, or about strangers who had been seen loitering in town months before the disappearance. Some whispered about old hermits who supposedly lived in the forest, unseen by most but known through decades of rumor. Others brought up tales of drifters who passed through once and never again, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Every theory had a cruel weight for the families. Each suggestion replayed the nightmare in a new variation, each one ending the same way, with their daughters gone. To them, the evidence felt both intimate and distant. They could hold the recovered shoe in their hands, smell the faint mildew that clung to it, imagine the moment it was last tied, but they could not see the face of whoever had been there with it. Grief became layered with confusion, and confusion with anger. At press conferences, parents demanded answers the police could not provide, their voices cracking as they repeated the same unanswerable plea, "Where are they?" The investigators, too, felt the strain. Journalists pressed for sound bites that didn't exist, while locals demanded faster progress. The case files grew thicker, not with clarity but with contradictions. The lead detective described it later as a story written in disappearing ink. Each time they thought they had a thread, it unraveled in their hands. It was around this time that folklore and fact began to blur. The cabin, once simply an old wooden shell, became almost mythic in the way people spoke about it. Teenagers dared each other to sneak near it, swearing they heard whispers inside, or saw shadows moving through its cracks. Adults avoided it altogether, claiming it carried a heaviness that couldn't be explained. The idea of the cabin transformed into something symbolic, the embodiment of everything the town didn't understand, everything they feared they might never know. And yet, for all its mystery, the cabin stood silent. It did not reveal what had happened within its walls, nor why the girls' belongings had ended up there. Its wood held secrets but gave no testimony. The forest around it grew thicker with each passing season, as if nature itself was intent on reclaiming the site, swallowing evidence into its roots and branches. For the families, the discovery was a cruel paradox. It was proof that the girls had not simply evaporated into thin air. They had been somewhere, once, after the hike began. And yet, knowing this only widened the chasm of possibilities. If the cabin had been a refuge, then why didn't they make it home? If it had been a prison, then where were they now? The silence of that place was louder than any answer, because it implied that someone, somewhere, still carried the truth, and had chosen never to share it. The discovery of the cabin was meant to be a turning point. Instead, it became a monument to uncertainty, a place where hope and dread existed side by side. People drove past the road leading into the woods and felt a chill ripple through them, as if the cabin had extended its shadow into their lives. It was no longer just a structure hidden by pines, it was a question carved into the landscape itself. A question that no one, not investigators, not locals, not even the families, could bring themselves to answer. The months that followed the cabin's discovery became a slow unraveling of hope. The structure had been expected to yield clarity, but instead, it spread uncertainty like wildfire. Investigators, stretched thin and worn down by the endless circles of speculation, began to chase shadows rather than evidence. The girls' case transformed from an urgent search into something murkier, a story that lingered without progress, kept alive not by leads but by the sheer refusal of families and townspeople to let it fade. The forest, once a place of hiking trails and childhood memories, became a labyrinth of dread. Parents no longer allowed their children to explore the woods alone. Hunters who had roamed the area for decades now avoided certain paths, as if the trees themselves had been contaminated by the unanswered. And every so often, someone would claim to have seen something strange, a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision, a figure walking deep among the pines, or a sound that carried across the night air that could not be explained. These stories might have been nerves, might have been tricks of the mind, but in a place already haunted by silence, they grew heavy, believable. For the families, life became defined by duality. There were days when hope surged, carried by the idea that the girls might still be alive, that the belongings in the cabin were remnants of a story not yet finished. On those days, mothers clung to the thought of rescue, fathers replayed the possibility of reunion. But then there were darker days, when the silence felt too final, too complete. Those days were filled with crushing weight, the idea that the girls had met an end long ago, that the forest had swallowed them without mercy. Grief took root in cycles, never resolving, always shifting between fragile optimism and unbearable despair. The town itself fractured under the weight of the mystery. Where once there had been shared unity, suspicion grew. Old grudges resurfaced, fueled by paranoia. Neighbors eyed one another with quiet calculation, who might have known more than they admitted. Who had something to hide? The handyman, the reclusive farmer, the drifter who'd once passed through, each became, in different conversations, a suspect. This suspicion eroded trust, and the town began to feel less like a community and more like a stage where each person carried the burden of guilt by association. The media, sensing the story's evolving eeriness, amplified the tension. Documentaries aired late at night with ominous narrators, framing the case as an unsolvable riddle. Reporters descended on the town whenever new whispers surfaced, shoving cameras into the faces of grieving parents and neighbors alike. The girls became symbols rather than daughters, their lives distilled into tropes, the popular one, the shy dreamer. The complexity of who they truly were dissolved into archetypes that fit television segments. To the families, it was like watching their children become ghosts while still not knowing if they were gone. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the case refused to disappear. Candlelight vigils were held every anniversary of their disappearance, each one drawing fewer people than the last, but always enough to remind everyone that the story had not closed. On those nights, the forest loomed like a silhouette at the edge of the gathering, a silent witness. Some spoke prayers aloud, others cried quietly, and some simply stood in silence, letting the presence of others fill the void words could not. There was something especially cruel in the way time moved. Seasons shifted, snow blanketed the woods, spring returned, years passed, and still the same questions lingered. People began to grow older around the absence. Younger siblings went to college, parents aged visibly, classmates moved on with their lives, but the girls remained fixed in 1999, forever teenagers, forever missing. Their photographs, taped to refrigerators and pinned to bulletin boards, yellowed with age, but the smiles in them stayed as bright and unknowing as the day they were taken. What lingered most was the feeling of unfinishedness. The cabin had not ended the story, but it had frozen it in place. It was a wound that scabbed but never healed, a question that hovered unanswered in the air. People spoke less about the case as the years stretched on, but silence did not mean forgetting. Instead, it meant carrying the weight inward, where it lived like a stone in the chest. Some nights, when the forest winds howled against the windows of nearby homes, families swore they could almost hear voices carried through the trees, laughter, or calling, or crying. These moments left them shaken, torn between superstition and longing. Was it only the mind playing cruel tricks, or was the silence of the woods still holding fragments of a story untold? By the end of the second year, the case had become less about what was known, and more about what was felt. It was no longer simply a missing persons investigation. It was a presence that lingered in every corner of the town, every hesitant step into the forest, every glance at the cabin's direction. The absence of the girls had become part of the landscape itself, like the river or the trees, something that could not be ignored, something that defined the place as much as it haunted it. The cabin's secret had been revealed, but in revealing, it had given nothing away. Instead, it left a silence louder than before, a reminder that sometimes discovery is not resolution, but only the deepening of mystery. And in that silence, the town, the families, and the woods themselves seemed to wait, for an answer that might never come. By the third year after the girls vanished, the case existed more in memory than in action. The search teams had long since disbanded, the police reassigned to other crimes, the news crews turning their lenses toward fresher tragedies. Yet in the town, the absence lingered like smoke that never cleared. The girls' names still passed quietly from lips in hushed tones, always with a glance over the shoulder, as if saying them aloud might awaken something sleeping in the woods. The cabin had become a landmark of dread. Though officially sealed, with warning tape stretched across its sagging doorway, the structure continued to draw the curious. Teenagers dared each other to step inside on moonless nights, their laughter echoing too loudly in the hollow rooms before faltering into nervous silence. Those who entered swore the air carried a strange heaviness, as though the walls themselves were watching. Some claimed to feel sudden chills, even in the heat of summer. Others said they saw carvings in the wood, symbols scratched deep into the beams, too weathered to read, but sinister enough to spark new whispers. Not all who visited came for dares. Some came to mourn. Mothers left flowers on the warped steps, pressing notes into cracks in the wood as if the cabin could deliver messages to their missing daughters. Fathers stood at its edge in silence, fists clenched, wrestling with anger they could not direct. For them, the cabin was not just a place but a cruel reminder of what remained unresolved. Over time, folklore began to wrap itself tightly around the story. Children growing up in town heard two versions of the forest, the one with sunny trails and fishing spots, and the one haunted by the missing girls. Campfire tales recast the cabin as cursed, a place that lured wanderers in but never let them leave. The truth, that it was a decaying wooden structure holding fragments of real lives, was almost more unbearable. Fiction at least gave the horror shape, reality left it unendingly shapeless. Investigators, when pressed years later, admitted that the case had reached a standstill. The items from the cabin had been catalogued, tested, and filed away, their meaning left suspended. No new witnesses emerged, no evidence surfaced. Time eroded what little remained to pursue. Even those who had once sworn to find answers began to retreat, not from lack of care but from exhaustion.